Good day. Today is Saturday, 17th January 2026, and let me remind you before I proceed with this program to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. If once you've watched this program or whichever part of this program you want to watch, you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Now, over the last 24 hours, we have had further movements on the ground by the Russian army in Ukraine, further indications that the energy crisis in Ukraine is becoming systemic and pervasive. But we've also had some diplomatic moves by President Zelensky of Ukraine. Firstly, he's hosted President Pavel of the Czech Republic. President Pavel is still in place. The pro-Western government that the Czech Republic previously had has now been voted out of office. The new Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, Prime Minister Babiš, seems somewhat less enthusiastic about support for Project Ukraine. He has actually come out and made comments about this. He said that the previous government, the government that's just been voted out of office, engaged in a significant amount of off-the-books financial manipulations in order to make possible the transfer of large quantities of weapons to Ukraine, and he's spoken of a total cost of something in the region of 700 million euros. I ought to say that the previous government, the people who made up the previous government, including the previous Prime Minister, have pushed back on some of Babiš's claims, or perhaps more precisely, they seem to be saying that Prime Minister Babiš was acting irresponsibly by disclosing this information as opposed to exactly denying it. Anyway, put that aside. President Pavel is still, however, there. He is the president. He is not the prime minister. And he is separately elected, and he's been in touch with Zelensky. And again, he's appearing to give Zelensky full support. And the two men met. And President Pavel appeared to be promising more weapons deliveries to Ukraine from the Czech Republic. I'm not sure how, given that the government appears to be opposed to this idea, and he seemed to be suggesting that the Czech Republic might provide fighter jets or anyway military aircraft to Ukraine, and it's been suggested that these are converted subsonic jet trainers, which the Czech Republic does indeed manufacture, and which could be used to combat Russian drones. Anyway, so there was that diplomatic movement. Much more significant is that Zelensky, as well as saying that peace is just over the horizon, that everything is almost resolved in the war, he's also sent what looks like a very strong delegation to the United States. If the reports about it are true, there are claims that the delegation will consist of Umerov, the former defense minister, Budanov, the former military intelligence chief, who is of course now Zelensky's chief of staff, and Arachamia, who is of course the head of Zelensky's parliamentary faction in the Ukrainian parliament, and who is a significant power broker in Ukraine, and who was for a time the lead Ukrainian negotiator during the negotiations that took place between Ukraine and Russia in the weeks leading up, in the weeks immediately following the start of the special military operation, up to and including the initialing of the draft agreement that the two sides reached in Istanbul in April 2022. So these are important people, at least important people within Zelensky's team, if you can call it that, and they've gone to the United States, where no doubt they'll be meeting with Witkoff and Kushner and also other senior American officials, though not, I think, Donald Trump himself. And in the meantime, Zelensky has had further meetings with other visitors to Kiev. One of the people that he met was none other than Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's ambassador to Britain, who was previously Ukraine's military chief until Zelensky sacked him in the spring of 2024, shortly after the fall of Avdiivka, and replaced him with Ukraine's current military chief, General Syrsky. So Zelensky, in this respect, has been relatively active. He's been talking to Zaluzhny, he's been talking to President Pavel, and he's been sending a strong delegation to the United States. And the big question is why? Why is he doing all of these things at this particular time? Well, it is absolutely the case that a couple of days ago, reports were circulating that Witkoff and Kushner, who, by the way, President Trump, at least in Kushner's case, has appointed to the board that is supposed to be supervising the ceasefire in Gaza, along with Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister. Trump himself is supposed to be chairing this board. Anyway, I will discuss this, no doubt, in a later program. Anyway, there were reports a couple of days ago that Kushner and Witkoff would be heading to Moscow, bringing with them some kind of plan or set of proposals. It's unclear which set of proposals. And, well, the Ukrainians and the Americans have had a very great number of interactions with each other. Zelensky did not like the original 28-point proposals or talking points that Kushner and Witkoff came up with. He substituted a 20-point plan, which, when you break it down, is basically a ceasefire plan, a freeze of the conflict on the existing ceasefire lines, what Zelensky has been insisting on ever since he was strong-armed by the Americans to agree to a ceasefire in March of last year. Anyway, I'm not sure whether sending Budanov, Umerov, and Arachamia is supposed to signal that Zelensky is backtracking on his ceasefire plan, his 20-point plan, or whether he's trying to achieve something else. My own sense is that what lies behind all of this activity, and also Zelensky's reach out to General Zaluzhny, is growing alarm about the realities that Ukraine is facing now. We will come to the military situation shortly, but in the meantime, we see blackouts in Kiev. The mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, has now said that Kiev is only receiving half the electric power that it needs to get through a winter. He says that Kiev has never faced a situation, a crisis like this, certainly in peacetime. I presume he means since the end of the Second World War. And there continues to be considerable argument and quarrelling between Klitschko and his team of officials and Zelensky and his government as to who might be to blame for the existing situation. And of course, as I discussed in my program, I think it was yesterday, the new energy minister, Mr. Shmyhal, who was just recently Ukraine's defense minister, he has now come out and said that there isn't a single power station anywhere in Ukraine, apart presumably from the nuclear power stations, which the Russians have been careful not to attack. Anyway, there isn't a single power station in Ukraine that is properly working. And I understand it is Zelensky himself who said that the situation in Kharkiv is particularly bad. There was a Russian missile strike using Iskander-M missiles on the power station that provides electric power to Kharkiv. Apparently, that means that Kharkiv, to all intents and purposes, has no power. And Zelensky, if it was him, is now saying that 400,000 people are experiencing a total blackout there in conditions where there is no heating, no lighting, and very, very severe sub-zero temperatures. So, an absolute crisis in the cities, a complete blackout in many of the cities. Kiev itself, the power situation there under extreme stress, quarrelling between officials as to whether people should leave Kiev, whether Klitschko's urgent advice that people should leave Kiev was appropriate and should be followed. For the moment, at least, there doesn't seem to be any intention on the part of Zelensky's government to start evacuating people from the cities. I think such an act, an evacuation from the big cities in Ukraine, converting them into empty ghost towns, though it is something that the government could organise and something which might, in truth, be its responsibility to organise. I think doing something like that in conditions of war is something that Zelensky and his officials would be extremely unwilling to do. It would reinforce the impression that Ukraine is dying, that the country is draining away, its life forces are draining away, that its economy is basically now a fiction. And, well, if the city's empty of people, that inevitably is going to have an effect both on morale and on the logistics needed to sustain the army on the front lines. So I think that Zelensky is going to do everything he possibly can to resist having to take that step, which, to be clear, would be a humanitarian disaster, and which, by the way, and for the record, and I speak as someone who is not an expert in these matters, I think that if the Russians really are conducting this offensive in the sky with the intention of emptying the cities, I think there would be certainly legal issues, and I can perfectly easily imagine that it might be construed and could be prosecuted as a war crime. As I said, I'm not absolutely certain of this. As many have pointed out, the United States and Western powers have done the same thing in several places, in many places. I remember this happening in Tripoli, for example, the Libyan capital, during the 2011 bombing of Libya. So I'm not saying that the Russians are acting worse than the Western powers have acted in conflicts. All I am saying is that I would not be surprised, and on balance believe, that if there is a plan to drain the cities of people, then it is a war crime. Though it must also be said for the reasons I discussed earlier in the program, it would also be an extremely effective act in terms of prosecuting the war. And that is, I'm sorry to say, part of the calculus of war. One might begin, as the Russians undoubtedly did, with an intention to spare the civilian population of harm. The Russians acted with extraordinary restraint, especially the first weeks and months of the war. But as the imperative of winning, and even more so, the imperative of avoiding defeat, starts to gain force, which it must do in a war, one inevitably sees inhibitions of this kind start to fall away, whatever the good intentions were at the start. I don't get the impression, by the way, that the Ukrainians, for their part, ever had those inhibitions, just to make that also clear. Anyway, whatever. The Zelensky government, I think, is going to resist as far as it can any mass evacuation of people from the cities. And I would add that if it is forced eventually to do that, very reluctantly, I think it will make as much and as big an issue of this in media terms as it possibly can. But for the moment, it is resisting doing it. What it is doing instead is that it is banging on the door of the United States government to try to get the Americans to do something that might persuade the Russians to stop this offensive the Russians are conducting in the sky, which is now becoming devastating, and to stop their advance on the front lines, which the Ukrainian military is finding it increasingly difficult to withstand. In my opinion, practically the entire diplomatic process, to all intents and purposes, the entire diplomatic process that we have seen, conducted by the United States, by Donald Trump, by Keith Kellogg, ultimately even by Steve Witkoff, and of course the Ukrainians, ever since Donald Trump was inaugurated president of the United States, the entire objective, the only objective, was to persuade in some way the Russians to stop, whilst leaving everything else hanging unresolved. So massive resistance to ideas about Ukrainian disarmament. The original Kellogg plan, on the contrary, spoke about the United States building up the Ukrainian armed forces during the period of the ceasefire. Great reluctance to spell out exactly what the terms of any peace agreement would be. Great reluctance to rule out conclusively any idea of Ukraine joining NATO at any point in the future. Always, when you look at American proposals and Western proposals, the option of Ukraine one day joining NATO, maybe not tomorrow or next year or in 5 or 10 years' time, but eventually, that option is always left there in the background. All of that refusal, as Putin repeatedly said, to grapple with the root causes of the conflict, first and foremost NATO expansion, but also the political character of post-2014 Ukraine. And I think that is the agenda that Zelensky is still following. He's still, despite the crisis that Ukraine is currently facing, he's still unwilling to acknowledge that in order to end the war, to end the fighting, and to preserve Ukraine, he's going to have to make concessions that ultimately go far beyond the idea of a freeze on the front lines. Anyway, there are words, suggestions now that the Ukrainians might be finally more willing to contemplate withdrawal of their troops from Donbass. Completely unsurprising, given how catastrophic the situation for the Ukrainian troops in Donbass has now become, given that we are probably only months now from the moment when the Russians start to encircle the cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and whatever defenders Ukraine still keeps there, and whatever forces the Ukrainians can commit to Donbass, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, soon being the only major populated centers that Ukraine will retain in Donbass, still under its control. So, apparently, possibly, just conceivably, the Ukrainians are now finally coming round to accepting the idea of some kind of withdrawal from Donbass. But then we come back to what I have been talking about in recent programs, the hardening of the Russian position. I think it was at the meeting with the generals on the 27th of December, but it might have been at the meeting with the generals on the 29th of December last year, that Putin said that Russia was losing interest in negotiating terms for Ukraine's retreat from Donbass. The fall of Donbass is now going to happen. There is no reason, therefore, for the Russians to concede on other points in order to achieve it. Obviously, the Russians will lose men and will lose equipment and money and treasure recapturing the rest of Donbass. But we have now reached that point in the war when the price that will be paid to do that has been so far reduced that it is a price the Russians are willing to pay in order to push harder on their further objectives. And in fact, as I discussed in my program yesterday, Putin made his speech to the ambassadors 2 days ago, in which he spoke about NATO's eastward extension after the fall of the Soviet Union, in contravention of promises made to the Soviet leaders. He said that the time has therefore come to renegotiate the entire security system in Europe, and that a Ukrainian peace settlement is now connected to this. My own sense is that he was basically saying that it's now become conditional on this, though he was careful not to spell it out. And, well, to say it straightforwardly, I think Zelensky and his other officials have missed the bus. I think that if there were any sincere intentions to withdraw from Donbass now, which the Russians anyway would probably doubt, just to say, the point has now been reached when the Russians will say, you are conceding that which you are anyway about to lose. So there is no value to us in this. From this moment on, you must concede much, much more. And your American friends must also concede more too. Specifically, they must concede the principle of a renegotiation of the security architecture in Europe. So I am treating these diplomatic moves by Zelensky more as a sign of his growing desperation and the desperation of the people around him. The situation in Kiev appears to be intractable. The energy situation in Kiev, to be precise, appears to be intractable. The energy situation in other places is intractable also. I vividly remember being told in the autumn of 2024 by a Hungarian diplomat in Budapest, I've discussed the circumstances many times, how the countryside in Ukraine has emptied. The cities, by the way, have already lost a significant part of their population, as many of the women and children have left. And, well, there is now at least a possibility that the cities are going to start emptying also before long. Ukraine is at risk, real risk, of becoming a land of ghosts with empty villages and empty cities, industrial facilities lying idle, boarded up shops. It's going to be like one of those films of post-apocalypse. And, well, that's perhaps not entirely surprising, because the war has acquired steadily, gradually, remorselessly for Ukraine something of the quality of an apocalypse. And the way in which this has gradually crept up on the country from a situation where, as recently as the spring of 2025, life in many of the cities on the surface appeared relatively normal to the situation we have now. Well, that makes this disaster, this calamity in some ways even worse. Meanwhile, the Russians, having said what they wanted to say, are remaining extremely silent. I have noticed that Russian officials so far are not confirming the coming visit of Witkoff and Kushner to Moscow. Maybe they're not especially interested in that visit. Maybe the Russians are playing for time. Maybe there are discussions taking place behind the scenes. Maybe the Russians have communicated to the Americans already. In fact, I've no doubt that they have communicated to the Americans already that the price of peace has risen. Of course, the Russians repeatedly warned that this would happen. They warned right from the start of the special military operation that the longer Ukraine delayed to agree a peace treaty with Russia, the steeper the price of that peace would become. And, well, we're seeing, I'm sure we're about to see, how that is going to play out and how the price of peace is going to become steeper still. The Russian Foreign Ministry, incidentally, has been making some more rather barbed comments about the British. This was in response to the comments by the British Foreign Minister, Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper, expressing strong disagreement with the discussions that have been taking place in Europe and which have now received sort of backing from Macron, Meloni, and indeed Friedrich Merz, that the time has come to resume serious dialogue with the Russians. By the way, one of the people who has now joined that cavalcade of European leaders who now say that it is time to start talking to the Russians is none other than Jens Stoltenberg, the former NATO Secretary General. He's come out and also said that the moment has now been reached when we must think about coming to some kind of terms with our neighbour Russia and all of that. Given the role Jens Stoltenberg played in 2021 and 2022 and thereafter as NATO Secretary General in sabotaging all negotiations, I have to say that listening to him now, watching or reading him now talk about resuming a dialogue with the Russians after all that has happened, frankly makes my stomach turn. I could use stronger words, but obviously I'm not going to. Anyway, so all of these people now talking about starting discussions. It's come far too late. They weren't listening to what the Russians were saying, that the price was becoming steeper, would become steeper, and now they're probably still anyway hoping to freeze the conflict in some form. And for the moment at least, they haven't yet fully resolved to appoint a peace envoy, and it might never come to that. And they haven't yet agreed on who that person is going to be, with some still advocating for the president of Finland, Alexander Stubb, who is practically persona non grata in Russia. Just saying. Anyway, that's where we are with the discussions at the moment. The Russians have made their comments. Putin has made his comments. The Russians continue to play their cards at the moment very close to their chest. There continues to be gathering reports that air assets are assembling in Western Russia for the major missile and drone strike on Ukraine, which is about to come. And there are also rumors of a further Oreshnik strike. There are stories that the ground is being prepared at the Kapustin Yar Cosmodrome, which is from where the Russians have launched their two strikes on Ukraine, the one that they carried out in November 2024, and the other one, which they carried out a few days ago against a target in Lvov. Anyway, there are rumors that a third Oreshnik strike is also in preparation, perhaps as part of this big strike that is coming. On the topic of the Oreshnik, there's been a series of very interesting analyses of the Oreshnik and of the effectiveness of the strike, provided by an interesting website where the handled by Mike Mikhailovich, who apparently has served in the past in the Serb military. Anyway, he provides much discussion about the war altogether and about international affairs, but he also has gone into great detail and a very extensive discussion of the Oreshnik. In fact, he's written 3 pieces about the Oreshnik, one from November 2024, another follow-up article that he wrote in January 2025, and he's just written a further article on January 16th, 2026, discussing the Oreshnik strike on Lvov and Oreshnik versus Lvov targets. And it's an interesting article, though, of course, as he freely admits, there has to be a degree of speculation about it. But it does seem fairly informed speculation. Now, what Mike Mikhailovich says in this article is that the strike does appear to have mostly targeted this base and aircraft repair facility in Lvov. He also says that most likely there was indeed some kind of command station in Lvov, in this place in Lvov, and probably it did have some role in managing Ukraine's drone campaign against Russia, though and perhaps even the drone attack on Novgorod. He's careful to point out that this is not the place where the Ukrainians and perhaps the Westerners who are assisting them would be controlling the drones themselves. But he explains carefully what the role of this headquarters would be, or rather this command position would be. He refers to speculation, and as far as I know it is only speculation, that the British Defence Secretary John Healey recently visited this facility. Now, if that is true, and I have no confirmation of this whatsoever, just to say, but if it is true, and apparently there is a lot of rumour and discussion about this on the internet, then definitely this would have been an important facility. I cannot imagine that the British Defence Secretary would visit a place of this kind unless there was something important there, just say. But he also discusses, this is Mike Mikhailovich, how the Oreshnik strike might have worked. He suggests, or at least he appears to suggest, that maybe fewer warheads, significantly fewer warheads, would have been used this time. And he suggests that the warheads that were used were specifically warheads, perhaps bigger, heavier warheads. This is to some extent my deductions from his article, of the kind that would be used to target a bunker complex. In other words, they are intended to go deep and far and to do maximum damage. And he discusses all of that, and he gives his own reasons or thoughts as to why the warheads themselves would not be equipped with explosive charges. He says that given the kind of energy that these warheads already have, simply from the velocities, the incredible velocities at which they move, an explosive charge, which would be difficult in engineering terms to achieve, would probably also be superfluous. Now, I found this an interesting article because it does actually match very closely what I was actually told by someone who immediately contacted me with information directly after the Oreshnik strike. He too told me that this was an attack specifically on this base, that there was a command post of some kind there, that the objective was to penetrate deep and far and to do damage, and that far fewer warheads were used in this attack than on the attack on the Yuzhmash factory in Dnipro in November 2024. This source suggested that it was because of the longer range and that you needed a lighter number of warheads to conduct this strike. Mike Mikhailovich's article suggests, as I said, that these might have been larger, heavier warheads intended to conduct deep penetration. But perhaps the most interesting thing is that both Mikhailovich and this source both floated the possibility, or at least discussed the possibility, that even as the main attack was probably on this base and on this bunker, it is actually quite plausible that there was simultaneously an attack by some of the warheads that the Oreshnik was carrying on the gas storage facility as well. And Mihailovich provides an interesting explanation about why there wouldn't be a fireball. He says that the gas is not stored in some giant cavern, but is contained inside gas permeable rock, and it wouldn't burn. And in fact, simply striking the gas reserve itself, because it's basically soft rock, probably wouldn't be a particularly effective thing to do. The more logical and effective thing to do would be to attack the surface facilities. That would render the entire complex out of action, put it entirely out of action, and that's what the Russians perhaps might have wanted to achieve. This article and the email confirmation, the email that I received, match each other on all of these points very, very closely. That doesn't, of course, make it true. And just for the record, I know that, there were definitely different people, and I could say definitely that they're not in contact with each other. So anyway, all very interesting. And by the way, Mikhailovich also says, not in this particular piece that I'm referring to, but in an earlier piece, that if the Russians were to decide to launch the Oreshnik against the command bunkers, the very deep command bunkers that Zelensky himself and his top military and political officials use in Kiev. And it turns out that the whereabouts of this bunker and its overall structures are actually well known. They date from the period of the Soviet Union. Well, if the Russians were to launch the Oreshnik with a specific objective of destroying this bunker, well, it can be done. It would be possible. Now, all of this is very interesting. It is not entirely, it does not match up exactly with the analysis of the Oreshnik strike on the Yuzhmash facility in Dnipro, provided previously by Professor Ted Postol on Daniel Davis' deep dive, which I have referred to in the past. According to Professor Postol, the sort of warheads used in the Yuzhmash attack would not penetrate very deep or very far. They would only do light surface damage. But I'm starting to get the sense that warheads, the Oreshnik system's warheads, can be configured in all sorts of ways. This is a modular system. And I suspect that there are some warheads that do some things and others that do different things. And that it's a misconception that there's only one type of warhead used in any one strike, just to say. Anyway, all a bit of a diversion from the point that I was making. But anyway, it does look as if the Russians are working towards another big strike on Ukraine, and it is likely that one will indeed come very soon. In fact, it has been under preparation for some time. We will see how extensive that is, but already Ukraine is going through a deep crisis, and further strikes of the kind that we have already seen are going to inevitably make that crisis even worse. So all of this makes it easy to understand why Zelensky wants a freeze of the conflict, and on the part of the Europeans, it's understandable why they would want a freeze of the conflict too, and of course that continues to be what they seem to be advocating. Now, here I would add something further. I've received, well, a certain amount of information from all sorts of different people now. Basically, all of them saying the same thing, that the American presence in Ukraine is actually dwindling. The American personnel in Ukraine are gradually, not actually gradually, now rapidly reducing. The CIA is still there, but the uniformed military are beginning to pull more and more of their people out. Some of the civilian officials are being pulled out also, just to say. The United States is perhaps not entirely closing down, but is reducing very significantly its Ukrainian operation. The Ukrainians apparently are extremely angry and embittered about this. There is apparently some talk, increasing talk, of betrayal. The Europeans are supposed to be making up the slack. They're supposed to be sending their people in to take over from the Americans. It's becoming increasingly and painfully obvious to the Europeans themselves how impossible that is to do, that Europe, the European countries, do not have the means to replace the United States in this sort of conflict. And at the same time, without, I'm sure, the Ukrainians being aware of it, without, I am sure, European governments and the European Commission being aware of it, the Russians are now starting to receive the first serious feelers from European companies, especially German companies, about the possibility of these European companies once again re-entering the Russian market. Apparently, these feelers are now becoming so extensive that the Russian contacts, who are overwhelmingly business people, are now reporting them to the Russian authorities and seeking guidance about how they should respond. And, well, the word is that Europe, in its current crisis, its deepening economic crisis, cannot afford to sustain the war. The business people are far ahead of the politicians in this regard. And basically, some of these European business people who are contacting the Russians are basically signaling that at some point before long, the Europeans are going to have to ask for some kind of peace settlement with the Russians at pretty much any price. One of the email correspondents who told me about this speculated that some of these Europeans are becoming so desperate now that if the Russians demanded Odessa as a price for ending the war and for resuming economic contacts with the Europeans, if it were up to the business people, they would not hesitate to pay that price. Anyway, a lot going on behind the scenes. It's never easy to know exactly where all this is leading. I remember that back in the spring, similar reports were circulating about how Russian oil companies had been contacted by American oil companies. This is soon after President Trump was inaugurated and after he made his opening moves to try to end the fighting in Ukraine, that the Russians received contacts from American companies. By the way, this was subsequently confirmed in the media, the media in the West itself. I remember reading articles in the Financial Times that straightforwardly confirmed it. And I remember also reading at that time that the Russian contacts, mainly people in the energy industry, who were being contacted by the Americans in that way, also referred to the Russian authorities, disclosed that these contacts were being made and asked for guidance, and that they received guidance from the Kremlin to be extremely careful. And I suspect that that's the same guidance that the Kremlin is giving in response to these contacts from the Europeans now. Anyway, as I said, a lot going on behind the scenes, but for the moment at least, to stress again, the Europeans can't get their act together. The British remain hostile, as of course do the Baltic states. There is no clear indication so far of anybody in Europe wanting to grapple with the underlying problems that caused the crisis in Ukraine in the first place. And the Russians, anyway, don't trust the Europeans and are already signaling to the Europeans, to the Ukrainians and the Americans that the price for an agreement has now gone up. Now, when discussing the Europeans and what they're doing, inevitably one has to bring up the topic of Greenland, because Greenland has the American demand for Greenland, which is intensifying. President Trump is now threatening to impose tariffs on any country, or in Europe presumably, or one might assume the entire European Union, if it seeks to stop his acquisition of Greenland. We've seen the Europeans in deep dismay about the Greenland affair. This was unexpected. It came for them out of the clear blue sky. Trump had talked about Greenland at the very start of his presidency, but I don't think the Europeans took him particularly seriously. And then the talk of Greenland seemed to go away. And now it's come back with a vengeance. Ever since the Strategic Survey Review was published a few weeks ago, Trump talks about it incessantly. He's appointed an envoy whose job it appears to be to try to find some way of transferring Greenland to the United States. He's been talking about the threat to Greenland from China and Russia. The Europeans, the Danes, have been trying to say that there is no such threat. There's been talk of sending troops, European troops, to Greenland. It is unclear to me completely what those troops are supposed to be doing in Greenland, whether they are supposed to be deterring Trump from seizing Greenland by deploying European troops to Greenland, or whether they're supposed to be reassuring Trump that the Europeans are indeed taking their responsibilities to defend Greenland seriously. As I understand it, the number of troops that the European states are deploying to Greenland, well, I've heard various numbers. Some say 10, others 25. Let's be generous and say that it's around 100, or it's a couple of hundred at most. Certainly not enough to deter Trump, Certainly not enough to reassure Trump. Certainly not enough to deter the Russians, who, by the way, have just published a statement saying that they have no interest in Greenland at all. As far as they're concerned, it is Denmark's sovereign territory. They have no intention or desire to seize it, and that all claims and speculations and rumours that this is their plan are false. Anyway, that's what the Russians are saying. But Trump himself seems to be absolutely determined to gain control of Greenland. I have discussed this now in many programs, several programs. There are all sorts of strategic rationales given for the US, for Donald Trump wanting to take over Greenland, that it is rich in minerals, that it opens the road to the Arctic, that it's part of the Western Hemisphere, which the Strategic Survey Review says is now the American sphere of influence. My own view is that these are mostly, though not entirely, rationalizations for doing something that Trump viscerally wants to do. But there is no doubt at all that all of this is causing enormous dismay in Europe. Some of the European leaders, the British especially, but to some extent the Germans and the French also, are saying to each other and are saying to Denmark that preserving the alliance with the United States, keeping NATO going, deterring the Russians, supporting Ukraine, all of these things are too important. And they are so important, in fact, so existentially important, that for the good of all, it might be better if Denmark sacrificed Greenland and gave it to the United States in the way that Donald Trump is demanding. I've discussed in earlier programs how that is classical 1930s style appeasement. I have pointed out that the Chinese government, through its media outlet Global Times, is saying the same thing. But even amongst these advocates in London, Paris, Berlin, and I suspect Brussels, these advocates of appeasing Trump, there is deep dismay. The former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen has said that he could never have imagined, he by the way is Danish, he could never have imagined that one day the United States would come and would make such demands of a European country and would insist on these demands in such a peremptory and confrontational and even aggressive way. And the dismay in Europe about all of this simply cannot be overstated. There is considerable discussion. You can find it all over the media. Another person who writes in this way, for example, another ardent Atlanticist, somebody who is implacably hostile to the Russians and historically very, very supportive of the alliance with the United States. Timothy Garton-Ash, for example, making similar comments to Rasmussen. Anyway, what they're all saying, and they're saying to each other, is, look, even if we appease Trump, even if we give him Greenland, well, firstly, there's a chance that he'll come back and demand more. There is now worries about Iceland, which is, of course, an independent country. But put that aside, this is going to have a disastrous impact on European opinion. It's going to shock people, perhaps in Scandinavia, most of all. Even if we can keep NATO alive after this event, NATO will be discredited and obviously on life support, and it will be very, very difficult to maintain preserve the fiction that the NATO alliance still functions in any meaningful way from this point on. And of course, the Europeans have also been busy looking at themselves, trying to understand where they are, and discovering how incredibly weak they have actually become. There's a long article in Unheard, again, about the catastrophic weakness of Britain's military and about the grandiosity of British foreign policy, which seems oblivious to the weak military position that Britain actually has. The article, whose title is Britain's Military Disaster, Our Credibility is Shot, is by somebody called Wesley Dutoit. Britain is heading for a military disaster in the next decade. That grim conclusion is difficult to avoid, given the enormous gulf between the ambitions of British politicians and the threadbare, confused state of Britain's armed forces. The year is barely a fortnight old, and already Keir Starmer's government has pledged boots on the ground in Ukraine, assisted US forces in hunting and boarding an oil tanker heading for a Russian port, bombed an Islamic State armed depot in Syria, and deployed 1,500 Royal Marines to Norway. The ambitions of British security strategy range from the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. Meanwhile, many of the country's basic capabilities, and especially the British Army, have been hollowed out by years of deep spending cuts and bureaucratic incompetence. The Ministry of Defence ultimately judged it could muster just 7,500 troops to enforce a ceasefire in Ukraine amid warnings of a £28 billion black hole in the defence budget. And it continues from there, and it confirms that even that deployment would very, very quickly become unsustainable given the absence of any logistical infrastructure to sustain it, and the shortage of men to keep a force like that in the field for any length of time. And this problem that Britain is facing is being reproduced right across Europe. There's been much talk about German rearmament. I read a recent report in which a German economist complained that even though an awful lot of money was being spent, so far there's been no actual sign of rearmament. The increase in military production volumes that he is looking for isn't remotely close to being met, and there is no reason to believe no long-term developments on the planning horizon which suggest that it ever will be. So logically, in light of all of this, in light of the pressure from Greenland, and to be clear again, and I've discussed this already, I have absolutely no doubt that Donald Trump will get Greenland in the bag, probably this year, probably by the summer. He might, as he has threatened to do, use military action to do it. More likely, he's going to bully and pressure the Europeans to get the Danes to give it to him. I doubt that he's going to pay $700 billion for it, which is the figure that some people are saying. I think he will, if he's prepared to pay for it at all, he will take it at only a fraction of that price, but sooner or later he's going to get it. The Europeans are caught between a rock and a hard place. They have mismanaged their diplomacy so badly that they are now facing difficult relations with both the superpower to the west of them, the United States, and the superpower to the east of them, which is, of course, Russia. They have destroyed their relationship with Russia. They have lost their access to cheap Russian energy. They invested everything on their relationship with the United States, and that relationship is turning sour. One of my correspondents who follows international affairs very closely, and who's done so, by the way, and provided analyses about what has happened in many places in the world, says that he has never seen a deterioration in relations take place so fast as the one that is now playing out between the Americans and Europe. According to him, and again, I have no corroboration for this, even intelligence sharing arrangements between the Americans and the Europeans are now being reduced, with the Americans becoming increasingly reluctant to share intelligence with the Europeans on a number of things. So anyway, there it is. So it's not surprising that European leaders in this desperate situation are talking about changing their approach, but to repeat again, they have given no actual sign that they are prepared to change their approach. So far, it's only mood signals, which, as far as the Russians are concerned, mean next to nothing at all. The Russians, of course, by now, having become deeply suspicious, understandably enough, and anyway, feeling that the point has been reached when the demands must grow. Now, that brings me to the situation on the front lines. And actually, there have been quite a lot of developments over the course of the last 24 hours. And there's been a lot of discussion about a visit that the Russian Defense Minister, Andrei Belousov, made to the headquarters of Group of Forces West, and a conversation, a report, a briefing he received there, mostly from the commander of Group of Forces West, Colonel General Sergei Kuzovlev. Now, Group of Forces West is involved in many very complex operations in Liman, in Svyatogorsk, I believe they are also responsible for the Siversk operations. And of course, they're also involved. They're also the people who claimed to have captured Kupiansk in the autumn, and who still claim that they control Kupiansk, despite the Ukrainian offensive that the Ukrainians say they are carrying out in Kupiansk, which has supposedly retaken much or all or most or some of Kupiansk. I'm not sure which it is, by the way. Anyway, there is a film of this briefing, and some have taken the exchange between Belousov and Kuzovlev on the topic of Kupiansk itself, because Belousov specifically asked about the situation in Kupiansk. Many have taken this as an admission that there is indeed a military crisis for the Russians in Kupiansk, and that Belousov is starting to lose patience with Kuzovlev, who supposedly has been lying about the situation in Kupiansk. Well, I am going to read the Russian Defense Ministry's account of this conversation, And I will also say that I actually watched the video of the exchange. But this is what how the Russian Ministry of Defense reports it. It says this: having received the report from the group's commander, that is General Kuzovlev, the Russian defense minister clarified the situation in Kupiansk. The words clarify the situation in Kupiansk is written in bold. And then we're given the exact quote. Generally speaking, I see that Kupiansk is currently being mopped up, isn't it? Andrei Belousov asked the commander. And then the defense ministry goes on to say, General Kuzovlev reported that all districts of the city are under the control of the Russian troops, despite the enemy's unsuccessful attempts to break into Kupiansk. And the words, all districts of the city are under the control of the Russian troops, despite the enemy's unsuccessful attempts to break into Kupiansk, are again highlighted by the Russian Defense Ministry in bold. And if you actually go to the film, there is, as I said, video footage of this exchange. Well, it seemed to me that it actually closely matches, in fact, it exactly matches this transcript. You see Belousov ask the question. Kuzovlev then replies. He says that the whole of Kupiansk is indeed fully under Russian control. The Ukrainians have carried out certain counterattacks towards Kupiansk, but they have been completely unsuccessful. And in response to those words, you see film of Belousov himself nodding vigorously in agreement. So that doesn't seem to me like an admission of a military crisis in Kupiansk. It seems to me like a denial of it. It seems to me that what this exchange was intended to do was to give the impression, or at least to clarify, as the Russian Defense Ministry puts it, what the actual situation in Kupiansk is, which, according to the Russians, is that the Russians control Kupiansk, the Ukrainians are engaging in counterattacks towards Kupiansk, that these are unsuccessful, and that the Russians control the town. Now, because Belousov and Kuzovlev are saying this, that doesn't, of course, prove that it is true. I am not there. I don't know what is exactly going on in Kupiansk. But all I would say, and I've said this before, if there is a successful Ukrainian counterattack in Kupiansk, it flies completely against the entire drift of the military situation everywhere else on the front line. And that, to me, makes it extremely unlikely. And the video footage I have seen up to now does not seem to me to go anywhere close to corroborating fully the Ukrainian claims. That's what I'm going to say. Now, as for the rest, we have had further reports. The Russians in particular seem to be advancing particularly rapidly in the Siversk area towards Slavyansk and in Liman. In fact, now there is clear evidence that the Russians have broken into Liman and do appear to be in the process not just of storming, but of capturing that particular town. It's perhaps worth pointing out that this is precisely the area of responsibility of General Kuzovlev, where, as I said, he seems to be making significant advances in other places. So why not assume that he's also holding his ground in Kupiansk, especially if he says so. But anyway, and the Russians have also made further significant progress in the Zaporozhye area. And, well, as I've discussed in many programs, this is clearly now becoming an area of further crisis. There's not been any further news of a big blow from the Russians in the area of Pokrovsk, north of Pokrovsk, where the Russians have recently captured Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. But following upon Gerasimov's visit to the headquarters of the local command, Group of Forces West, I strongly suspect that such an attack is going to come within the next couple of days or weeks. So anyway, deteriorating military situation. We are in this unusual period in this war. For the first time in this war, the events on the ground are being overtaken by the events in the sky. The Russian bombing offensives and missile offensives on Ukraine are dealing so much damage that it seems to me that this is now what is perhaps shaping the overall military situation and what is driving the diplomacy. Anyway, the Russians are involved in other things. Putin certainly has been involved in other things. The Iranians have released their own account of Putin's conversation with President Pezeshkian of Iran. And I noticed that, according to the Iranians, Pezeshkian thanked Putin for his support. The support in question appeared to relate to certain comments made by the Russian representative at the UN Security Council, but that we haven't been provided with a complete account of the discussion between Pezeshkian and Putin, either by the Iranians or by the Russians. The fact that the Iranians are thanking Putin, thanking Russia, does suggest to me, I see it anyway, as further confirmation that the Russians were indeed active over the last week or so and played a significant role in helping the Iranians to quell the protests in Iran through the jamming of Starlink. By the way, coincidentally, today, the Russians have said that their own analog to Starlink is going to be operating in 2027. They're going to start production of their own equivalent of Starlink terminals this year, and they're going to launch the entire satellite array starting from 2027, when the system is going to become functional. So that's what the Russians are saying. It was an interesting comment, but anyway, I suspect that by now the Russians have got a great deal of understanding of Starlink and how it works, and that must have enabled them to sort out the details of their own analog much more quickly. Anyway, so that was what Pezeshkian said. Donald Trump, for his part, has said that the only person who convinced himself not to launch the strike on Iran was himself. All these stories about the Arabs, the Arab states, the Israelis coming to persuade him to hold back from a strike, all of that is untrue. It was he and he alone who made the decision. That is, of course, absolutely typical of Donald Trump. I would say two things here. Firstly, the reason the strike did not take place was because the Iranian authorities were able to regain control of the internal situation in their own country, making it extremely unlikely, or much less likely, that a military strike on Iran at this time would indeed finally collapse the regime. And given that the objective was to collapse the regime, the idea of a strike had, to a certain extent at least, had mostly lost its value. It is precisely because the regime, the Iranian government, in other words, is intact and still in tight control of Iran. It is that is the reason why, after apparently having advocated with Trump at their meeting on the 28th of December for an attack on Iran, over the last couple of days, Prime Minister Netanyahu reversed and started to ask the United States to hold back from an attack on Iran. The one thing Israel cannot afford is a long duration attrition war with Iran. The circumstances of the 12-day war in June of last year made that clear. Israel does not yet have the in-depth air defense facilities to counter a prolonged Iranian missile offensive. If it looked as if the regime was tottering and a military strike would deal the knockout blow, well then by all means go ahead. But it makes no sense to start a war now with a regime, a government still in place, able to hit back and able to do so in ways that Israel at the moment, for the moment, simply cannot counter. So that is why there wasn't an attack. Not ultimately because people told Trump to stop, but because the Iranian government survived the crisis and is still there and continues to be in control because it quelled the protests on the streets. That is one. The second point I want to make is that I have not heard that anybody has countermanded the orders to the USS Abraham Lincoln supercarrier and its accompanying task force to sail from the South China Sea to the Persian Gulf. So the United States is still deploying assets to the region, and that strongly suggests to me that at some point the attack will come. In other words, it has been postponed. It has not been conclusively and finally cancelled. I'm going to finish this program by briefly touching on two further things. Firstly, the Russian Economics Ministry has published information about the state of the Russian economy. It says that inflation in Russia for 2025, for the whole of 2025, was 5.6%. Now, if I've understood that correctly, I'm not entirely sure whether that is overall inflation or whether it was inflation for a particular group of services and products. But I believe we are talking about inflation overall. Then it looks to me as if the inflation problem in Russia that began to take off in the summer of 2024 has been mostly overcome. We will start to see over the course of 2026 significant cuts in interest rates, and that will offset falls in oil prices and all of the other things. It will be the cuts in the interest rates that will determine the pace of recovery, or at least of growth, within the domestic Russian economy. Meanwhile, alongside his conversations with Netanyahu and Pezeshkian, Putin has also had a telephone conversation with President Lula of Brazil, and it's centered on the question of Venezuela. The Russian readout says that Lula and Putin were in agreement with each other about the course of events in Venezuela. I've repeatedly pointed out that the major great power or prospective or latent great power in Latin America, which might one day challenge the United States, is not Russia and it is not China. Both of those countries are far away. Far more plausibly, it is Brazil. The Brazilians have shown their complete inability to respond to what took place in Venezuela. But they are obviously unhappy, and Lula and Putin, unsurprisingly, therefore talked about it. What the Brazilians are going to do in the future remains to be seen. It depends entirely on internal developments within Brazil. Meanwhile, I noticed that John Radcliffe, the CIA director, has visited Caracas, where he has had a meeting with America's proconsul, or should I say interim president of Venezuela, depending on which it is, Delcy Rodriguez. Clearly, the dialogue between the Americans and the Venezuelans is emphatically underway. And I have to say that the presence of Radcliffe and his meeting with Rodriguez, brings me back somewhat to the view that Rodriguez absolutely was aware and was informed about the fact that an operation to remove Maduro from the scene and to take him to the United States was being prepared. And like other people within the Venezuelan leadership, she basically complied with it. Anyway, we will see what happens, but it is indicative, even though perhaps it is not fully conclusive. The pictures, short, small, Rodriguez, looming figure of Radcliffe did, however, as far as I was concerned, give a very, very clear picture of the power dynamic between the two. Anyway, there it is. This is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.